happy to see you. This is such a treat.
Well, Katie, why don't you just get started and give us a little bit of your background um, in therapy? Why are you passionate about this subject? Give us a little bit of a background for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been a therapist for about 20 years now, but I worked initially with children and teenagers and thought I would do that for the rest of my life. I loved them and just thought that was my calling and what it would remain forever. And then actually, when I got pregnant with our oldest, Robbie, who's now 13, I was meeting with clients and meeting with teenagers in my office, and it was like a switch got flipped, and like all that kid energy kind of went out of me to just straight to him, and I wasn't as maybe passionate or um, thinking that I was going to continue to meet with kids for the rest of my life. Long story short, right before maternity leave, I was meeting with a teenage girl, and she was dear and struggling. And I had this conviction and this thought that came to me, and it was, I really think that I could help this girl more if I could help strengthen her parents' marriage. Like that was the thought that came to me. And so when I came back from maternity leave, that was it. I shifted and did mostly marriage. I've done a lot of kind of everything from pre-marriage to marriage in crisis, like marriage on the brink, and everything in between. And so I just love supporting couples in whatever stage they're in. And a lot of them right now are, of course, raising children, and sometimes that causes conflict, and they have different ideas of what's required, and that can create some stress for sure. So that's why I'm passionate about this subject today.
Awesome. Well, Katie, I'm so glad you are here. And I know, whoops, we all need to, sorry, you guys, I'm trying to let people in and I'm skipping
You're
through all my stuff, but
you're doing great. It's a lot to manage.
well, we today, when we asked Katie to come in, we thought, okay, well, what are the things that we know parents are kind of dealing with and struggling with? And so, as Katie mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we're not on the same page as parents or with anyone who is involved in raising the children, whether it be a grandparent or a co-parent or a step parent.
Mm.
What we can do to get on the same page, and then things to watch for to kind of be like, are we not on the same page? How do I really know, Katie? So, let's dive in. Let's start with tell us a little bit about what do you see when families and people who are raising kids are not on the same page, Katie?
Yeah, and I would say, there's a lot at the beginning of life that probably most parents can agree on, whether it's, changing the baby's diaper, when feeding, these kinds of things are a little bit simpler and more linear. I'd say the stress really starts more around the toddler years, usually. And basically, not being on the same page can take people by surprise when all of a sudden, one parent facilitates a moment very, very differently than the other parent, and it's all of a sudden like, why'd you do that? Like, what was that didn't work? Just all of a sudden we're like, wow, we're not on the same page. And of course, not being aligned with parenting strategies. When do we discipline? How do we discipline? What important things value wise do we want to focus on and instill, and how do we do that? What about mealtime? What about bedtime? There's so many things involved with raising a little human, and it's just a lot of work and a lot of time. I just, and I think all of us can say we've experienced moments, maybe seasons when we haven't been aligned with our spouse. And it's pretty understandable that that causes a lot of stress. We can start blaming, we can get into arguments and fights either behind closed doors or sometimes just in front of the kids, because we're not on the same page about what is happening and how we want to tend to that together. We don't have the same strategies, and it just causes a lot of tension, and the kids feel it, of course, but it's stressful, it's exhausting. So yeah, I'd say that that is one of the biggest pain points. And I also think, did you have a thought on that, Peyton?
No, go ahead and then I'll jump in a second.
Yeah, and I also think there's this thing that I see in my office a lot, when parents are not aligned and kind of talking about their perspectives with regard to raising their children, and I termed it like tug of war parenting, and that tends to happen when parents have different styles of discipline, and sometimes that's because they were raised in a certain way and they think that's right, or they were raised in a certain way and they think that was a hot mess and they have pivoted, and so what happens is when each parent has a different idea of how to discipline, over time those differences tend to make them pull even to the extreme versions of those styles. So one maybe was raised in a, one parent have been raised in a very harsh and critical home, and she has decided, you know what, not for my family. I want to be soft and gentle. I don't want to have all of that yelling and tension, and so I'm going to, really always keep my voice under control and quiet, and get, down on my children's level. And maybe that child is really throwing the family for a loop, and, acting out and throwing fits and having issues. And this mom says, but I will never raise my voice. I do not want to do that. And the dad is looking at the same situation and going, this is kind of a mess. We need to get the reins here, And so he might elevate his voice, and she's like, oh, honey, let's not, we don't do that. And he says, well, we need to make it clear who's in charge here. And so the more he escalates, the more she lowers her voice. And all of a sudden they're on these polar opposite points, and they're just pulling back and forth, back and forth. And it's so painful for them. And it's confusing, of course, for their kids, because they're like, which is it? And that's hard, but it's also understandable why this happens over time, isn't it? Because, again, we make decisions based on our experiences, and sometimes we don't even know that we've decided on a certain style. We're just responding to how we were raised, and we're just kind of winging it. Try, like, I want to be soft, I want to be gentle, and we maybe neglect the other part of having boundaries and being a little bit more assertive. So anyway, the tug of war parenting is a real challenge.
You know what, Katie? I think
Yeah.
it's really interesting what you just said about how it really, whatever your partner does, if it's opposite of you, you tend to kind of double down on yours. I feel like that is, and then the kids know, I laugh.
Oh,
Stan and I, when we are not on the same page, our kids are, I know you're about to jump on that, but like they are like so savvy. It's crazy. Like,
oh,
be like, no more screen time. And Stan will be like, well, I mean, like, what's 10 more minutes? And like,
yeah,
neither of us are wrong, right?
right.
But it's like we're not on the same page, and the kids know exactly what to do to like make it worse. And then he and I are like glaring daggers at each other, and they're the problem, right? And I'm like,
Yes.
how did this happen?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, they do. They know how to just drive a freight train through that disconnection and get their way. And that doesn't mean that they're terrible people. It just means they're human, and they want what they want, and they're finding a loophole, and they'll go to who they see they can go to get their way. And that creates also a lot of tension and kind of blaming, with couples. So yeah, I think that and we can all, I mean, again, whether it was a moment like you're talking about, Peyton, or a season, I mean, I don't think there's a couple on the planet that has ever been perfectly aligned. I know Steve and I are not. We sometimes get surprised by our misalignment. Like, oh, really? You think that's okay? And I don't, whoa, we need to have a powwow over here, and get back on the same page. So yeah, for sure.
Well, and and Becky, you were in education and you see the kids whose parents are not on the same page for more than a season, perhaps.
Mm.
Can you tell us a little bit about like how does that show up for kids in school, Becky? Do you
Mm.
have any like stories about that?
Well, if I did have particular stories, I would not be able to share them, but I do know that many times across my desk, I would be speaking to a couple who were not on the same page and had not taken the time to get on the same page before they came to me when there was a school issue. And I think that the number one thing that we need to always pass on is that, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this, Katie, is that it has to be done in private. The work has to be done. It has to be done behind closed doors when the children are not present. And in cases of sitting down with experts or school teachers or administrators, whatever, it does pay to have a pre-meeting, get on the same page before you show up in a meeting with a professional. In my interview with the Westminster graduate, who's a doctor out in San Francisco, she was eager to tell me that as they use that method 1, 2, 3 magic, they actually give each other a wink when they see their spouse losing calm.
Mm.
When their spouse is the one no longer following the strategy of remaining calm and keeping your voice down, if they see that in their spouse, they go ahead, they have a signal, and the one who's kind of losing it goes and takes a walk around the block or whatever, and then the other parent takes over. So there are methods. I'm eager to hear what Katie has to say about what are those little strategies that can help, because we're all prone to losing our cool.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Katie, tell us a little bit about, all right, most of us can even think of a moment or a season, or we're like, I am in this season right now,
Mm.
with my spouse. How do I get back on the same page?
Mm. Yeah, and I just want to comment that there are so many resources. You're talking about, 1, 2, 3 magic. There are, and depending on the kids' ages, there's resources like Boundaries with Kids. There's The Whole Brain Child by Dan Siegel. There's different Love and Logic is a great one for younger kids. There's a lot of resources. Today am not necessarily going to prescribe the model or the strategy of parenting, because I do think that is up to parents to decide what is our strategy. But the most important thing to keep in mind is we need to be emotionally regulated and in charge. We are the authority in this home as the oldest and most experienced members. But we need to, whatever we're doing, we need to be under control ourselves. So whatever strategies or resources you use to get aligned is not so much my job today to tell you, but it is to say, your job is to be the calmest and most in charge people in the room with whatever strategy you're implementing together. So one idea that I love, because as you said, Peyton, we kind of can get in the weeds, especially when our kids are young or when they're older, teenagers, like just the busyness and the frenzy of life and school and activities. I think it bodes well for us to take a step back as a couple. And as Becky said, doing that privately, just saying, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? Like, what is it? What is the point of parenting? What would we like to be able to say when our children leave our home, when they're no longer under our roofs? What would allow us to say, hey, good job, honey, we did it, and these things are in place. Starting with the end in mind is really important. There's a book by the Stanleys, who lead Buckhead Church here in Atlanta, and it's a great book. It's called Parenting, Getting It Right. And I always like to read books and gain wisdom from people who are way ahead of me, like Becky, and just people who've done it and have launched their children, and people they're still intact. The kids are doing okay. But one of the things that I love, that they say in the book, they said, we started with the end in mind, and the what we deemed success would be is if our children wanted to come back and be in relationship with us as the parents and each other as siblings, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And so they decided that their discipline strategies and the things that they were going to do in their home would always kind of keep that main goal in mind. And I just love that, because that's a relational goal. That's a good goal. So something like that. So starting with the end in mind and saying, what do we really want to be about? What is this? What would allow us to deem this as a success, right? Um, again,
I'm going to interrupt and just say,
yeah,
I think that you really have to also get a little granular and
sure,
say, because I love that you want that healthy relationship with your adult children. Your children
sure,
are in their 20s, you have a great relationship. But you also say, well, what do we want our children to be like?
sure. Yeah,
And
character. Yeah,
their character, right? What are the innate qualities that we want to foster? But also as small as is my child going to say yes, ma'am, and yes, sir? Because
sure.
I've seen parents separated on that, and it's kind of a very small but daily occurrence. So if one parent is pushing that and the other one thinks it's stupid,
Yep,
you've got a problem there. It's a tiny little granular thing,
yep.
but do we want our child to respond like that?
Yes, that's so important because it is granular. Even though I'd like for you to start with the end in mind, that involves a daily decision to what are the things that are going to lead to that? What are the things that are going to
Yes.
lead to an adult who is in a good relationship with their siblings and their peers? It's all of these character building moments, and it starts very young, and we have to be aligned on what are those things. That's the second kind of thing that I would suggest, though, to get to that place would be reflecting together on your own childhood. One of the things I ask pre-marriage couples when they're sitting in my office, and I just love them so much. They're bright-eyed and ready for life together. And they're amazing. But one of the things I ask them is, hey, what are some things from your family of origin that you would like to bring forward into your marriage? And what are some uh, dynamics or experiences that you'd like to leave behind? And so in terms of parenting, I might ask, what are some ways that you were parented or that grew up that you really respect? You want to repeat that strategy worked, again, whether it's like manners or how we spoke to adults or eye contact, respect, all of these things. What were some things that were really valuable to you? You liked how your parents modeled that and taught that. And also, what are some kind of ineffective strategies or dynamics that you experienced in your family of origin that you want to make sure that you don't repeat? That is such a robust conversation that creates such connection, first of all, and empathy and depth of conversation, but it also allows you to clarify, okay, in this house, how do we want to do it, and why? That kind of brings me to the third part. Maybe you want to consider creating a family mission statement, or simply writing down values and ideals that you want your family to rally around. Things like Becky, you were talking about. I think there's some pretty core things that are important in terms of character development, and you want to speak about these things. Honesty, obedience, maybe you would say, when they're younger. What are some things that are really important, and how are we going to celebrate when we see those things being reflected in our kids, and how are we going to correct or discipline when those things aren't present? And again, rearing a child is a long game. But there are certain points where you're going to change what you're focusing on. But I would just say deciding what are the values and ideals, the qualities that we want our family to be reflecting, and how are we going to praise it when we see it, and how are we going to correct or pivot when we don't? What are the discipline strategies? What are the natural consequences? Those it's important to get aligned on those things. The last thing on this page is, how do we do that? Well, we need to read and learn together. We can't just wing this. I mean, we do want to talk about what we want. We want to talk about our childhoods and how that impacts what we think is important. It's important to clarify values, but also we need resources. There are so many resources that give us strategies. And I see a lot of couples who, one of the reasons they're so stressed and burned out is because they've been winging it for years. They just react to whatever the moment brings. And often they're not aligned in their reaction, and it just creates a lot of chaos. And there's a book by actually a business author and speaker. His name is Patrick Lencioni. He writes all of these wonderful books talking about business principles and how to make companies more effective and all of this stuff. He's written one book called The Three Big Questions for a Frantic Family. And he writes about a fictional family in this book. And the point that he is trying to drive home in this book is that if most couples and families, companies operated like most couples and families, they'd probably be out of business. And what he means by that is the lack of intentionality that sometimes happens to us in our home just because of the stress of daily life, the lack of structure, the lack of alignment, the lack of, agreed upon tools and strategies. That is going to kind of crumble a family because it's not intentional, it's not aligned. Successful companies kind of inherently know, well, we got to be aligned. We got to figure out what we're about. We got to put procedures in place that back that up. So, it's just important to decide to know part of intentionality is learning and reading together, listening to a podcast, maybe make a goal. We would like to read one book, even one book a year. Let's pick a book that we read this year that is kind of pivotal in our children's developmental time, and let's talk about it. What from this book are we gleaning? What can we apply this week? What strategies do we think will be most effective? It would be great to just glean from these experts and this wisdom that we have at our fingertips.
I love that advice, Katie. I think that's so important that parenting be intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And literally my prayer throughout my time when the children were in the home was, help me to be proactive rather than reactive and have a plan. I always admired the families, the couples that went ahead and took a retreat weekend once a year. I thought that was brilliant. I can't say we ever got our act together to do that. But that dedication to pre-planning and finding the time, setting aside the time was so important.
So important.
Well, and it's funny, this is not a plug for Katie or therapy per se, but the best advice that Stan and I got when we were right at the very beginning of getting married was go to therapy together 3 or 4 times a year, just quarterly, when things are not on fire. And so I laugh, like Stan and I go to our therapist and a lot of times he's like, what's up? We're like, not a whole lot, but we're just here. It's like a checkup. and
I love that.
Does, but just like, as you said, like we're frantic. We don't have time. I bet a lot of people on this call are thinking like, well, how much time to like read a book with my spouse? Like they don't even read, whatever. Like,
yeah.
And so maybe it is like, okay, we're going to pay somebody so that we have time to like sit down and talk about the important things because, you really kind of do need to, as you say, make it a priority.
Yeah. Yeah. And be creative. I love Peyton. Thank you so much for saying that because this is not a one size fits all in terms of how we learn and grow together. Some people are readers, some people are not. And some, I have couples who are like, the only time that we, do any of this intentional stuff is when we're on a road trip and the kids have their movie in the back and we listen to a podcast on the way and we talk about it. And, maybe we get a nugget and we apply it. It's not a one size fits all, but the point is we must, as Becky said, pre-plan, be intentional so that we're not always just reacting and putting out fires using different tools, So
awesome. I love this. Okay. So if I'm like, am I on the same page? Like, it's not horrible, Katie, but I don't need to like, I'm not calling my mom crying because me and Stan are not on the same page. But like, what do I sort of look out for as little those pre-warnings?
Yeah. So this is sort of more for the experience of within your marriage. I mean, one could probably know that you're misaligned if the parenting strategies are off and like the house is chaotic. Okay, fine. So that could tell us that we're not aligned. But what I would think is there's some subtle things, kind of emotions or experiences that start to creep in that for me are always red flags to to they indicate that there's a lack of alignment and connection and agreement on how we're doing this together. The first is just bitterness. I have couples who come in and they're just so frustrated with each other. They just that frustration grows over time, and if it's not solved, it leads to this just bitter experience. Like, I just don't really even like you very much. I'm so frustrated. It just, grows. And it's so hard to see that because nobody gets married wanting to experience bitterness with their spouse. So again, I think this happens when we make these compromises, these in the moment quick decisions. Okay, whatever, if you want to do that, just do it because I don't have the energy, just these compromises, instead of, as we've been discussing, being intentional, making some us decisions about how we're going to parent, what we want to focus on, what things our kids are throwing at us in this stage of life, and how we're going to navigate that. We need to make us decisions that are informed and agreed upon. Otherwise, we'll just kind of compromise and, as I said, wing it. And then when things go wrong, what happens? Well, you know what? You shouldn't have done it that way. That was a mess. We just start to resent each other's different strategies. So that bitterness, that resentment, that would be to me a red flag that there's a lack of alignment. Also, just simply burnout. And I think this happens later than bitterness, a little bit further down the line. But, when couples aren't aligned, it just takes a toll. They get just fatigued. They just give in to the kids, to each other. They give up. They start kind of just doing their own thing in the evening. They get the kids to bed, and one person goes to their room and scrolls, and the other person's in the basement watching TV. Just there's this burnout. And that's so heartbreaking because also nobody gets married wanting to be, separate and disconnected from each other. But again, that lack of usness, that lack of alignment, that lack of intentionality will cause these things, to come to be in a relationship where they never wanted that, and it just, is it fixable? Heck yes. Let's get aligned. It's never too late to get intentional, ever. It's never too late. And there are ways to do it. So, that's the hope,
For whatever reason, what you were just saying made me think about my car and how when the wheels get aligned, it like the whole car just like, it's messed up, it shakes, the brakes don't work, everything's wrong. But then I take it in, periodically to the shop and they align the wheels or whatever. And it's like, oh, it gets smooth, right? And
Love
I
it.
do think that the strategies you gave us about like some of those conversational topics, having some books, even just having both people come on to something like this and listen for 10 minutes, like you've got a starting point.
Yeah, I think one little clue when the to watch for is when the kids start going to both parents with the same question.
Oh, yes.
Right? To see who says what. And I think my husband was extremely supportive in that way. When one of the kids would come to him, he always asked first, what did your mother
say? Love it.
What did mom say? Because he could sniff it out. He knew they were trying both and seeing what they could get and then trying to pit us against each other. So his question and then mine would be, what did dad say?
Yeah. Becky, that's worth its weight in gold. I mean, that is some serious wisdom. And that's back to what we were talking about when the kids can sense that disconnection and they'll wiggle their way through that real fast. Yeah.
Yeah, they will.
Yeah.
Well, y'all, I want to make sure that you've got Katie's contact information because even if, she's just such a good resource and a great friend. And we're so thankful that you joined us today, Katie.
Oh, happy to be here. And even if you just want some resources and you don't even want therapy, just email me and I'll send you my favorites and the ones that have helped couples the most. Happy to just share those.
Awesome.
That's great.
Use normal disclaimer. And then if you need contact info for me or Becky, you've got it right here. And then next week, Becky is going to come up with 1, 2, 3 Magic Discipline Strategy Part 2 as requested.
The other half of 1, 2, 3 Magic. I have to just, before we hang up, I was talking to my one daughter about advice and about all these books and all the parenting experts. And she said, she's just now starting to raise a family. She said, I love advice. I listen to everybody's advice, anyone who wants to give it. And then I think about it and I take what I want.
I love it.
And really, Peyton and I are trying to give you guys a smorgasbord so that really then we hand it to you. You sit down with your partner and you discuss what parts of each piece of wisdom belong to us, will we adopt for us. So we really, really appreciate Katie. She's got a lot of wisdom. It was really a privilege for us to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. It was such a treat.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Come back next week.